So she mentioned, my name is Ryan. I'm the naturalist at Great Council State Park. And there's kind of two prongs to this presentation. The first part, I'm going to talk about the historical background of the archaeological site that Great Council sits on. And the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the facility that's there today. Now, Great Council State Park, like you probably just heard mentioned, sits on at least a portion of the site of a Shawnee village that was there from 1777 to 1780. So only about 3 years. The building itself, the property we own, is most likely on kind of the north tip of the village. So a lot of the village is going more towards Xenia and south of our property. Now, the village itself, I should talk about, I guess, the Shawnee that lived there a little bit before I get into the historical events that happened. And the first part of that is this picture. So this picture is our only confirmed picture of a Shawnee person from before 1800. The reason it's confirmed, the guy that drew this, he titled it An Indian of the Nation of the Shawanos. And it's a nice watercolor. It's meant to be as part of a map originally, and gives us a good representation of what people are wearing in this time period. Is this what a lot of you expected when I pulled that image up? No. What were some of the things that were different then?
The colors.
Color. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a big thing, color. So at this point, we're talking about people that have traded with Europeans for about as long as it has been for the time for them. It's as old to them as the American Revolution is to us. So it's a long settled thing. This is something people are relying upon every day for all sorts of items. If you think about how we are today, I know this shirt that I'm wearing says made in Vietnam. Much to my chagrin, I keep saying that, and I have not checked any other article of clothing I wear. And that's probably how this guy is living. He probably hasn't checked any of the clothing he's wearing and knows exactly where it comes from because it's an everyday item. It's something he's relying upon day to day. A lot of what he's wearing, pretty much all of it, can't be sourced even in the Ohio country originally. About the only things that can, that ornament, the kind of rusty red ornament that's hanging from his shoulder, that is likely deer hair that's been dyed and wrapped around a cord. And then his shoes are moccasins. So those tend to be made out of leather, and that just seems to be the de facto. Everything else, his leggings, those bright red leggings, are wool. His breech clout, which is what is hanging out from underneath his shirt, it's kind of the top half of his pants ensemble, if you will. That's wool. His shirt is just a linen European-made shirt. And what's thrown over his shoulder is about 2 yards of wool cloth, often called a match coat. And then he's got silver earrings. He's probably got on those leggings glass beadwork. It's likely what the white is. And that stuff's coming from all over the world. Bright red dyes from Mexico, glass beads from Italy and the Czech Republic. The silver either from Europe or parts of Canada. That blue dye is probably a very pale indigo dye, and that's coming from Japan. So very globalized person in this day and age. Now, I said this is our only image. It is not our only description. There's a lot of writings that talk about how people dressed back then. One of them from J. Carver, he says, the men of every nation differ in their dress very little from each other, except those who trade with the Europeans. These exchanges their fur for blankets, shirts, and other apparel, which they wear as much for ornament as necessity. They throw their blanket loose upon their shoulders, and holding the upper side of it by the two corners with a knife in one hand, and tobacco pouch, pipe, etc. in the other. Thus accoutered, they walk about in their villages or camps. Mostly that's describing that match coat that's thrown over his shoulder. It's also far from the only description of that. You'll hear it called a blanket. I've heard it once compared to a Roman toga or praetexta. That's a comparison. There is no linkage there culturally. But lots and lots of descriptions of this kind of a dress. Now, given this guy is a little bit more dressed up than if he were hunting, he's posing for a picture. And just like how we do nowadays, you pose for a picture, you kind of dress up a little bit. And he happens to be also holding a bow and arrow in this, even though he's not really dressed or built for that, that kind of activity in this current outfit. Now, a little bit more generally speaking, so this image, it is not a one-for-one recreation of any Shawnee village, but it is a rough estimate of what one could have looked like. Most of these buildings, you'll see the kind of round dome shaped buildings there. Those are called weekwas or bark dome houses. Those are typically a single family house. The other building shown here, I think, is probably depicting what is called a longhouse. You might hear it sometimes called a council house. I think of that a little bit like a combination between a community center and a government center and a church. Basically, anytime you're going to have a community activity that is not happening outside, it's happening inside, it's happening in one of those buildings, and there would typically be one. The only times you'll see multiples like that would be if you have multiple communities that are occupying the same area, where each of those communities would have their own separate longhouse. And most importantly, there's crops, there's farmland. The Shawnee were primarily sedentary and agricultural. The idea is, unfortunately, in the years of European contact, not always what happens, but the idea is to live on the land and on that piece of land for as many years as it will support you. You're not moving from place to place, not picking up and leaving very often, realistically, hopefully staying multiple generations. Now, for descriptions of this kind of a life, it's got to find the right sources for that. If you think about the people that are interacting with tribal nations historically, in this time period, you've got politicians who are, first of all, probably only interacting with other politicians. And as I'm sure you're all aware, are never a good cross-sampling of society at large. You've got soldiers who are also only interacting with their counterparts. And again, not a good cross-section of society either. The last one is missionaries. So missionaries, their goal, they're trying to collect as much information about these communities as they can. They want to understand these communities. They want to record it so that when they begin to preach and try to convert people, they have adapted and shaped their preachings and their teachings to whatever community they're living with. So they're recording how the regular person is living. One that's really important for us in this time period is a man by the name of David Jones, because he's traveling through the Ohio country in the 1770s. He's recorded as saying of the Shawnees, "They are the most cheerful and merry people that I ever saw. The cares of this life, which are such an enemy to us, seem not to have yet entered their mind. It appears as if some kind of drollery was their chief study. Consequently, both men and women in laughing exceeded any nation that ever came under my notice." That's a pretty flattering description. And I think there's a little bit of grass is always greener on the other side in there too, but he's seeing people thriving and just living a good life out here. Now, to get into a little bit more of the timeline, one other thing I have to mention, do have to at least mention Tecumseh. So Tecumseh is often associated with our site at Great Council. Now, with the resources that we have available, it's most likely he was actually born north, up near where Springfield is today. There was a Shawnee village there. It would have been called Pequot at that time. If any of you have been up there, that is now the site of George Rogers Clark Park there in Springfield. He gets associated with our site because there was an author that is quoted as saying that he was born in the neighborhood of Old Chillicothe. I see that a little bit like I live in Centerville, and I would say I live in the Dayton area. Sometimes even if I travel far enough away, I just say I live in Dayton. Same thing happening there. Chillicothe is much better known, gives a better reference point to a wider audience. We've got a couple of things. One of them is actually this quote, Duncan MacArthur to Benjamin Drake, 1821. Now, given Tecumseh dies in the 1810s, this is pretty contemporary. And he says, when on the way from Greenville to Chillicothe, the Tecumseh pointed out to us the place where he was born. It was an old Indian town on the northwest side of the Mad River, 6 or 7 miles below Springfield. If you pull up Google Maps today, that lines up almost perfectly. George Rogers Clark is right between 6 and 7 miles in a kind of a south declining line from the center of modern day Springfield. There's another source that actually comes to us from James Galloway Sr. that drew a map of that Pequot town, and he put a big title on the bottom of it that said the birthplace of Tecumseh too. Now, to get directly into the timeline, the first part that's really important to us is the end of the 7 Years' War. I know I learned about that in high school as the French and Indian War. It's a global conflict, and as global conflicts do, they often obtain multiple names. This war ends in 1763. And the biggest outcome that affects the story at Great Council is that document on your right, my left, the Proclamation of 1763. It's a ton of text. I have not read all of it. The important parts, though, if I can distill that into something more visual, is it establishes this line. So this red line, it follows roughly the Appalachian Mountains, and it sets the western border of the colonies. That proclamation is essentially saying that there shall be no British subjects west of that line. He's doing this for a couple of reasons. First of all, that war is incredibly expensive for the British monarchy, and he's looking for any way to recoup money. And one of those ways is protecting economic interests to the West, specifically his trade with tribal nations. That accounts for a third of the British economy during certain parts of their history. So it's super important for him to be able to recoup costs, but also, I mentioned it's called the French and Indian War. There are tribes fighting against the British monarchy. So this is also a concession. This is trying to be peaceable and say, well, we're not going to encroach any farther than we already have. Unfortunately, this doesn't really work too well. This is not like you and I would imagine a border today that are often well marked or well patrolled. There might be some kind of a barrier or a gate there. This is just a line that to your average British subject is going to look just like that piece of paper. So there are people that are choosing to cross that line. And especially 1763, we're 13, 14 years before the revolution. There's people who say, well, I'm not a British subject anymore, so I don't have to listen. And we'll step across that line as well. The community that comes to live at Oldtown, at that site, at this point, they are living at that orange dot there. That is at the mouth of the Scioto, where it meets up with the Ohio River, modern day Portsmouth. And because of that encroachment, they actually move upriver on the Scioto, somewhere between here and a quote actually from our friend Reverend David Jones again. He's quoted as saying, Monday the 4th, set out for the river Scioto, and about the middle of the day came to the mouth of it. The Shawnee Indians formerly lived near the mouth of this river, but finding that their enemies had too easy access, they moved their habitation up the stream. And that's in 1773. So sometime in those 10 years, they are shifting northward. And that's what this map shows. This is on the Pickaway Plains. It's south of Circleville and north of Chillicothe is where this is. And you can see, it's kind of zoomed in there, but even at this point, that town is being called Oldtown or Chillicothe. Like I mentioned, people are moving a lot at this point. And part of that movement, it kind of causes a search for identity. And that takes what may have originally been a name for a location on a map, and it evolves more into the name of a community over time. So everywhere where that community lives is called by that community Chillicothe. That's the reason why, I mean, if you search in Google Maps, you'll probably get 100 results for Chillicothe that do coincidentally roughly follow the path that the Shawnee were removed on. And why that site's called Chillicothe, and why Oldtown is also called Old Chillicothe. The old part comes from the Europeans trying to delineate and separate the two between that and the European Chillicothe. If I add that to my map, that looks like that yellow dot. So moving just a little bit northward. Now the next part of that, 1777, involves the death of Cornstalk. So Cornstalk is a Shawnee leader. And at this point, we're in the middle of the American Revolution, right? And he's trying to work for the best future for his tribe. So he's talking to the British and to the soon-to-be Americans, trying to work out agreements with both sides. So whoever wins, the Shawnee end up in an acceptable position. So before this, he heads up to Detroit. It's controlled by the British at this point, talks to them there. And in November 10th, 1777, he's at Fort Randolph near modern day Point Pleasant. And while he's staying there, it's him and three men, one of which is his son. There is an unknown native person that shoots and kills a colonist outside of the fort. Unfortunately, then a mob forms inside the fort and they find the nearest scapegoat, which happens to be Cornstalk. This picture is not from the time, but this does pull some details from reports from the time that mentions, for example, Cornstalk was shot 7 or 8 times. And mind you, that's with muskets. So it was definitively a mob, multiple people. His son is shot where he's seated. One of the men tries to flee up the chimney or hide in the chimney, and he's shot down. And then the last man, for the life of me, can't find details on how he died, just people wishing he died quicker. So this is a pretty gruesome scene, especially in response to somebody that's trying to negotiate peace. And you can imagine what this does to Shawnee folks in general, but specifically to that Chillicothe community, which is his community. He lives in that village when he's not out traveling. And that causes a movement sometime there in the winter from that yellow dot to, there it is, the blue dot there on the Little Miami River. That's where Great Council is today. So that is part of what helps place our the occupation of that settlement. The other part, and a lot of the rest of the story here, has to be told through European sources. The Shawnee traditionally have what is called an oral history. I think of that a little bit about what you tell your kids about yourself, and then what they're then going to tell their kids about you. There's certain things that are going to be really important and crystallized, and other things that are going to disappear. Versus Europeans that are often writing, battlefield logs, or there are receipts floating around, or they're writing journals about these things, very specific dates that otherwise wouldn't be recorded. And part of that story is this fella. Does anybody know who this is?
Daniel Boone?
Yeah, it's Daniel Boone. Yeah, he is a little older in this picture than he actually is in 1777. He's about 40 in 77. He is in the Ohio country with a group of men boiling salt. And they are captured because they are trespassing. They're north of the Ohio River and they're not supposed to be. And the rest of his men are taken north to Detroit. Basically, the Shawnee pick them up and then dump them at the nearest British place of government and say, here you go, they're your people. They broke your laws, so you can punish them however you need or want to. Boone, though, ends up staying at Chillicothe. He's adopted and lives as part of the community. This is not an uncommon thing in this time period for Shawnee families to do, especially if you have a hole in your family. If you lost someone, you'd often find a replacement, and that person would be welcomed in the community and made an equal member. It could be very specific. Perhaps you have a mother that lost a small child, a small boy, and wants a small boy to fill that hole, or just happens to be a 40-year-old that ends up getting adopted. Either way, some people end up staying for a long time, especially women are often treated much more fairly in these communities and will stay their entire lives, even given a choice to leave. He describes it pretty positively in his journals. So he's captured in February 78. What I've got here is from April, where he talks about, at Chillicothe, I spent my time as comfortably as I could expect, was adopted where I became a son, and had a great share in the affection of my new parents, brothers, sisters, and friends. I was exceedingly familiar and friendly with them, always appearing as cheerful and as satisfied as possible, and they put great confidence in me. I often went hunting with them, and frequently gained their applause for my activity at our shooting matches. The Shawnee king, Chief Blackfish, took great notice of me and treated me with profound respect and entire friendship, often entrusting me to hunt at my liberty. I frequently returned with the spoils of the woods, and as often presented some of what I had taken to him, expressive of duty to my sovereign. So, I mean, he's being trusted to go wander out in the woods and do his thing. They're clapping him on the back for a job well done in community activities. He's truly part of the community. He even mentions Chief Blackfish there. So both Chief Blackfish and Cornstalk are both leaders. The way Shawnee government is often visualized is it's 2 hands and a brain. So there's 2 male leaders, frequently male anyways, that are the enactors of what a female leader is deciding back at home. So at this point, though, only Chief Blackfish he's the only recorded one of those two hands that's still around. That might be where some of you, if you've heard the word war chief, peace chief from before, that's the origin of that. Because often they are often opposed. They're not just hands, they do voice their opinion like the rest of the community does as well. But ultimately, women are making the decisions. It is a matriarchal and matrilineal society. But it doesn't reflect that way when interacting with the British, because they refuse to deal with what are called petticoat governments, oftentimes by the British. So frequently you need folks like Blackfish or Cornstalk to be go-betweens. But yeah, he's here for a couple of months. He doesn't stay forever. The reason he leaves is that he hears that the warriors in the village are planning an attack on Boonesboro. If your name is Daniel Boone, that's probably not good news. So he leaves the village, presumably in the dead of night, and he makes it all the way down to Kentucky on foot to get there ahead of that. And the next day, I mean, his family would have woken up to an empty bed, and that would have been it. He does end up warning them ahead of time. And by the time that Shawnee military action arrives, he's now fighting against people that consider him a brother or a son or a nephew. So it's kind of an interesting situation. I don't believe he sees it that way, especially the way he writes a lot of his journal, but certainly his adopted family would have. Now, getting closer to the end of Oldtown, this kind of place is the beginning. So somewhere between probably December or January 77 or 78. The next part involves this guy. Does anybody recognize him? Jefferson, yeah. He's much younger than I think a lot of us are used to seeing on bills. And this is truthfully much younger than when he's depicted on the bills too. He's only governor of Virginia at this point. And it's kind of a weird thought, right? That the governor of Virginia is playing a part in a story about Ohio, but that wasn't Ohio back then. This was potential interest to Virginia. So he is talking to George Rogers Clark, mostly through letters, and gives Clark two options. He can either campaign against the British in Detroit, or he can try to clear out the Ohio country of the native folks that are living there. Clark chooses the second, and on January 1st, 1780, Jefferson sends him this letter, where he's quoted as saying, "On the other hand, the Shawnees, Mingos, Munsees, and the near Wyandots are troublesome thorns in our sides. However, we must leave it to yourself to decide on the object of the campaign. If against these Indians, the end proposed should be their extermination or their removal beyond the lakes or Illinois River. The same world will scarcely do for them and us." So he's kind of given a blank check, almost, Clark is. And that's written in January. Clark does not get to Oldtown until August 6th, 1780, so the same year. Now, given what I've been talking about, would you all guess there was probably a military action, some kind of a battle that happened at Oldtown? You're hearing some yeses, some maybes. It's actually interesting, there isn't. Clark gets about 5 miles out before he calls them spies. He's really talking like scouts or forward men, regroup and say, "Hey, people are moving in the village. I think we were seen. You all need to hurry up." There's a little bit of contention as to who actually saw them. I've seen reports that it was a dog that started barking. I've also seen that they just straight up got seen by people from the village. Either way, by the time Clark gets to Oldtown, to Old Chillicothe, it's already on fire and it's been abandoned. The people living here set the village on fire and they left. They moved actually to that Pequot town I talked about earlier, just north, and joined that Shawnee community. Clark is quoted as saying about this, "Marched up the valley, up the Little Miami. Nothing occurred until within 5 miles of Old Chillicothe, when the spies returned, gave information that the Indians appeared to be moving off from the town. The army now commenced to run, kept a good smart trot, but when they reached the town about midday, they found the Indians had that all gone and burnt their own town. Some pots were found over the fires boiling green corn and snaps. The troops found a great relief in green roasting ears and string beans." So there's basically ruins left over. There's some things that aren't quite caught on fire, and I think Clark probably burns a couple extra things for fun, because he's quoted as saying to Jefferson that he and his men burnt the village down. This is in his journal. In the letter to his boss, he writes that he did it. So it's kind of interesting there. So that's August 6th. If any of you have been to George Rogers Clark Park, they often call it the Battle of Pickaway up there. That's August 8th, 1780. So 2 days later, Clark ends up at that Piqua town. And that is a very short encounter. Clark realizes pretty quickly that they've taken all of the women, children, and elderly out of the village and hid them up on a hill in and behind a fortified blockhouse. So it's only fighting men in the village. So he starts shelling that blockhouse where the civilians are. And at that point, everybody clears out. There's a cat and mouse chase after that that kind of keeps pushing people further and further west. The end result is by 1830, Shawnee people are located on 3 reservations here in Ohio: Hog Creek, Wapakoneta, and Lewistown. That's roughly where those 3 dots are on the map. Now, that is not where they stay. The reason I say 1830 is because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. That's signed into law by Andrew Jackson. Although it's not really his original idea, it's kind of continuing Jeffersonian politics there. But when that occurs, people are then removed from those 3 reservations and moved westward to Oklahoma, along with most tribal nations that are still to the east of the Mississippi. The kind of interesting thing about the Indian Removal Act, it's still online, so you all can go and read the actual text of it. Mentions nothing about forced removal in the whole bill. It simply talks about exchanging land, which is how it starts. People are offered, if you have 25 acres in Ohio, you are offered 25 acres in Oklahoma if you forfeit your Ohio property. Although that forced removal starts once the administration realizes people weren't dumb enough to take that deal. And then people get moved. About 1832 is when that removal occurs. Now that kind of creates an interesting situation in Oklahoma today. Have any of you seen this map of Oklahoma before? So this is a more accurate depiction of how Oklahoma is laid out politically. Before it was Oklahoma, it was called Indian Territory, and most of that territory was set aside as reservations. So today that acts as tribal jurisdictions in Oklahoma. Each of these colors is a different tribe. Some of them have been combined, like the Cheyenne Arapaho share a space. But each of these are different governments that are operating almost as sovereign nations here in Oklahoma. Our 3 partners working on Great Council, the 3 federally recognized Shawnee tribes, are the Eastern Shawnee, the Shawnee, and the Absentee Shawnee. The Absentee Shawnee, their territory is that little kind of teal box. It's above the big blue Chickasaw box there. It's a little hard to read, but it says Citizen Potawatomi and Absentee Shawnee, so they kind of share. And then up in the upper right-hand corner, so kind of northeast, there's a ton of tribal jurisdictions in that little space. So it has to be zoomed in, and you can see where Eastern Shawnee and Shawnee are in that green area. So part of the project here at Great Council was to bring this back from Oklahoma to Ohio. So like I mentioned, the Interpretive Center itself, we worked with the tribes and we got their input on almost everything. Color schemes, the general design of the building. This is what they picked out of a series of architectural ideas that were presented because it is representative of a Shawnee longhouse. Not an exact recreation, but kind of a spiritual recreation of that in a modern style. Which is fitting because our building acts as a community center still. People are able to come in, hang out, learn things, and it's still kind of the same use as that building would have had historically. And the colors and the materials are meant to kind of mimic wood. If any of you end up going, you'll notice we've got these, they look like wood panels on the front. They are not wood panels, they're actually aluminum, but designed to look very believably like wood. I had to walk up on my first day and like knock on it just to make sure. but lots of dark brown earth tones to make it more welcoming and inviting. The inside of the building is the same way. So not really any plain white ceiling tiles, for example. The floor is that nice kind of a darker brown. And of course, the skylight. So you won't see that if you come today. We're having a little bit of construction going on this month and next month. But that is supposed to represent the opening in the top through which smoke would escape in an actual longhouse design. Now, the property itself. So what we have, the red is our property, the green is the Little Miami Conservancy. So we've got about 15 acres, give or take. And that includes kind of where that line is, where the Interpretive Center is, right up on 68, that's running north to south there on the right. And then we've got a restored prairie out towards the back with that half-mile loop trail. And then it connects up to the Little Miami Conservancy's property that heads down to the river on their trail as well. And a little sneak peek, that little box that's across the street, they're doing construction on that now. That's going to be a pedestrian bridge that goes over 68. And it'll connect right up to that dotted line, which is the Little Miami Scenic Bike Trail. So that's being worked on currently. Don't have an expected completion date on that one. It's an ODOT project. So we'll see when that gets done, but that'll be really cool. We don't have a whole lot of plans for expansion. We have what's called a conservation easement. So we are not able to build on anything that isn't or wasn't already disturbed earth. So like the trail is just mowed, but like footprint wise, we're where the Tecumseh Motel used to sit, as well as using a little bit of somebody's, I believe we bought a house parcel and a business that was next to it. And then we've got one little blueprint in the back that we can use too in the future. But for foreseeable future, this is what Great Council will look like, with probably some improvements that happen. Inside of the building, so on the lower level, we have a rotating exhibit space. Right now, it is an exhibit that was put together by the Ohio History Connection. And it's called From Monolith to Mosaic. It's trying to break down tribal identity and take it from Native American to talk about what does it mean to be Shawnee? What does it mean to be Chickasaw, Seneca, Cayuga, Delaware, et cetera? And what does it mean to be a person and all of that as well? So there's lots of pictures down there of people just as they were. I mean, you've got everything from Levi leading Fox up there, all dressed up, to the guy in the middle wearing his work polo, and just a lady on the bottom in a t-shirt, you know, just as people were. That ends up looking a little bit like this. Now, I did mention this is a rotating exhibit. This is with us for our first year. So it's going to leave sometime probably in June and go to an Ohio History Connection site. And then we'll have hopefully something else that'll fill that space. Now upstairs, what I also think is really cool, we have native language on almost all of our signs. We've got the Shawnee, two different translations. They're both pronounced the same, but there is no unified writing system as of yet. So we worked with the 3 tribes to narrow it down to just 2. I think there's 6 or 7 in use at the moment. That would be visible on all of our signs. And they're direct translations of like that one on the end that says roles and responsibilities. And upstairs, where a lot of those signs are, looks a little like this. It flows counterclockwise. So it starts where that little kiosk is and it comes out towards you. This is a view standing from the elevator and wraps around, talking about pre-contact, pre-European contact, early contact, late contact, and then you can see removal, assimilation, and then modern day there in the back. And then just give you an all idea. That's what it looks like today. Well, a couple months ago, but still, not a concept image anymore. Another really awesome exhibit. You can't see it from that picture because it's behind my back, so I'm taking that picture. But we have a Weequahic, a recreation of one of those bark dome houses. It's been pulled apart a little bit to let some sunlight in, but the inside is kind of giving you an idea as if a Shawnee family just got up and left. This is an idea board of items to put in there. When we actually take it a step further and look at the real deal, that's what it ends up looking like on the inside. And we rotate things around. You'll notice in the middle there, our sign says fall. we've been changing things as the seasons go, making things a little bit more obvious, less obvious to match with the ebb and flow of the seasons there. And the last part was really important to our tribal partners, that we talk about modern day. That the tribes are not something from the past. They're still active, they're still alive. So this exhibit is a round exhibit. It's split into four divisions. So 3 of those are 2 panels for each of the federally recognized Shawnee tribes. And the last set talks generally about tribal sovereignty. What does that mean today? What does it mean to be a tribal nation? Things like that. It ends up realistically looking something like this. So each of the tribes was given a panel to put text on and a panel for images, and they were able to format those and fill those with whatever content they wanted to. So some of them have citizenship requirements on them. Some of them talk a great deal about the creation of their seals, whatever was most important to them for visitors like you and me to be able to read and see. Now, that's all I have specifically, unless anybody has any questions. Yes,
You mentioned missionaries as a source of ethnographic information.
yes.
Did you find any reports from French or Dutch traders?
French and Dutch, a little less so. Most interactions with Shawnee folks are most frequently English, but you do get some trading. There's a really good book. It is called Their Bearing is Noble and Proud. There's 2 volumes to it. Volume 2, personally, I don't like as much. But volume 1, the guy went through every source he could find for roughly this area and this time period and ripped out every reference to appearance, clothing, makeup or paint or hairstyles, or trade goods, and isolated it and compiled it in a book with very helpful index in the back that lists out every little thing you want to find out about shirts. Okay, shirts are on pages 10, 12, 40, 59, etc. The second volume is a lot of trade lists, things that people are bringing and selling. So, right.
What kind of relationship did the Shawnee have with other tribes?
That depends on the tribes. There are certain tribes, specifically like the Delawares, for example, that are very culturally close and related, that would have had very amicable relationships. There's actually a guy, if it says anything, there's a guy that wrote a captive narrative. He was adopted, and he says, "Life amongst the Delawares." Well, somewhere about halfway through, he's no longer with Delawares and he's with Shawnee folks, and he never knows the difference. Clearly, people that were living in that more would. But then you have other things like the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, or the Iroquois. It's all kind of names for the same things. They're the reason that the Shawnee are forced out of Ohio for a brief period in the 1600s, because they are expanding westward. So there's some good relationships and there's some more tense relationships too. Cool. Yeah.
Before people go, they should go to the South Reading Room and see the exhibit of Indian relics that is there. It's been there for about 6 or 8 weeks and it's going to be coming down this week.
Okay.
Here in the library.
Okay. Here in the library. Got it. Cool. Yeah.
So are there any excavations, like, I think it's like a little bit like Sunwatch where here's where a post was from the building, and here's where something like, you know, identification of a real archaeological spot on the land there, and maybe also the nature or how it relates to the native plants.
So there's a couple aspects to that. The archaeology that was done, that we have access to right now, is from the 80s. Where before Great Council was a thing, it was just private farmland. There were 2 prongs to that, where first, it was a group from Wright State. The professor went out and talked and collected information from farmers. What'd you find? Where'd you find it? And the second party brought a bunch of students out to do some rudimentary surface, literally surface level, earthwise, examinations of things. All of those artifacts are currently with Wright State. But beyond that, we don't have any precise plans to do archaeology. That is kind of up to our tribal partners. It's their village, so it'll be up to them whether we end up digging into it any further. I know recreating those structures outside is not something they want to see right now. Especially because it is hard. It's really hard to put the community back into a village like that. You know, I can go out and I can build a Weequa, but it would just be like me going out and building a building and then never living in it. That would not be the same as having a building that is constantly lived in, constantly maintained and kept up with. It's gonna look different. It's gonna be different. And that's part of the reason they don't want to see that. I hope in the future we will do something, some kind of non-disturbing, low impact imaging or something like that to see what's down there. But for now, no concrete plans. Yeah.
What differentiates the three branches on?
So it starts with removal. It starts with those three reservations. I mean, just like any time where you take a group and you split it in three and give it enough time, there's cultural drift that happens. Two of those groups, they follow a similar path where they move west through Missouri, hook up through Kansas, and down into Oklahoma. One of those three goes into Texas, and some of them straight into Mexico too. And when they seek federal recognition later, they are already culturally distinct enough. They still work together, but functionally they act as different governments. I think I saw another question somewhere. Yeah.
Activities are you possibly planning for school children?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've had, I believe the number when I last counted, we've already had 10 groups come in just this school year. It'll probably pick up next year, all things considered. It's a little hard when you open in June, and a lot of those schools need to be planned a whole school year ahead, like they're planning right now for their next school year. But yeah, absolutely. If any of you know anybody that wants to come in, even for a not school group visit too, if you go to our website, that's got the contact information for my park manager, and she can help work that out. I should also mention that we are open Wednesday through Sunday. So usually it is 9 to 5. Thursdays we open until 8, and then we open at 11 on Sundays as well.
Are there any activities outside, like with the prairie or the land, or any like stargazing or anything like that?
So we have one or two programs that utilize the outdoor space, but most of our programming is inside of the building, especially as we're just coming out of winter and it being pretty cold and rainy. So that is a good point. We do have regular scheduled programs. That's on our website as well. We do tours too that are pretty much every day. It's 10 and 2:30. So yeah, any other questions?
You mentioned you don't have a estimated completion date for the connection to the bike trail,
Yeah.
but is it funded? Is it gonna be in the next 5 years, the next 2 years? Not a specific date, but just you have a feel for about when?
Well, it's already, I mean, the bid has already been decided. It's already gone out to somebody to work on. And part of that complication is it is an ODOT project, which is not Parks and Watercraft. So they don't communicate with us like if something's being worked on the building would be. But I know this project has kind of been Governor DeWine's baby. So I believe a lot of these ideas for the space are going to be completed, hopefully, before he leaves office. That would be my guess. That is not an official statement. I'm not sure. Because truthfully, I am not sure. I've not heard anything either way. Yeah.
You actually have any Shawnee who come and talk?
So currently, my supervisor, Talon Silverhorn, is a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. He's there almost every day. Right now, we don't have anybody except that. We're hoping, as this continues, we'll be able to build relationships and have people come out here. It just becomes very financially restrictive for people to travel all the way from Oklahoma, because pretty much the entirety of their population is in Oklahoma. But that, I mean, hopefully for the future. Yeah.
Just a little bit, if you could fill in, you mentioned Governor DeWine. How did things progress from that farmland and the motel there? And can you give us a little bit of history of how that moved then to the great display you have there now?
Yeah, so it started out, Governor DeWine got a hold of Mary Mertz. She's the director of ODNR, Department of Natural Resources, and said, hey, I'd like to find some kind of a historic site to establish during my term in office. And that, after a little bit of searching, ended up being Oldtown. And it also happens to be pretty close to where he lives too. So he's got a little bit of a stake in that as well. And then the next part was deciding what to do. An interpretive center was not on the bill from the word go. There were a lot of different ideas. I think there was a storybook trail floated at one point with some kind of a native author's story on it, or a rest stop with bathrooms and 1 or 2 displays. But as it got deeper and deeper in there, people really wanted that interpretive center. We actually only started out with about an acre of space. So there's a reason our interpretive center, beyond just the Tecumseh Motel being there, there's a reason that is right there on the road. It's the footprint we had, and it was the only space we originally had before we got that extra behind us. So there was that parcel there that was the Tecumseh Motel. There were 2 smaller parcels next to it, and then there was a farmer that owned a lot of the swath that kind of swings around, and I'll pull it up. So kind of that swing back there was owned mostly by a private farmer. And those were all bought up and united to be the park. And then they had to go through different ideas to workshop exactly what it would look like, exactly what it would contain and things like that.
Nice.
Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more. You had mentioned that if anyone's dumb enough to trade, 150 acres in Ohio for 150 acres in Oklahoma. I suspect Oklahoma is a little bit drier. Does anyone have information on, would you have a crop yield of 40 bushels an acre in Ohio and 20 bushels an acre in Oklahoma? Like, how much worse would the land be?
So I don't have any exact data on that. Oklahoma is really dry though. And most importantly, so not only is it kind of a little bit barren by comparison, it's also not the kind of environment that Shawnee folks are used to living in. A big thing, for example, for the Shawnee is maple sugaring, and making that sugar from maples every year. There are no maples in Oklahoma. That's just one aspect. There's a lot of things like that where traditional life doesn't make sense when you pick it up and try to plant it in a different habitat there. And then also, it's a long distance move too. People eventually adapted. Nowadays there are other trees in Oklahoma that are tapped for sugar instead, but even still, it was pretty rough land to be living out on. I think it's a little bit funny that it ends up actually being kind of good land in the end, because there's a lot of oil in Oklahoma. So the government ends up regretting that decision a little bit in the end. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. You mentioned that there were some surplus artifacts found,
Yeah.
Wright State. Has anybody tried to get them from Wright State to have them on display there? Or is there a problem with the indigenous people of Shawnee not wanting them on display?
So we haven't specifically worked with that. I know Wright State right now, it's a little hard to get anything from them at the moment. Especially that project was 25 or 45 years ago, and not connected to our facility, not connected to anything with us, except it was on the same property. And then there's also possibly the issue that some of those artifacts are probably not the same time period either. There were plenty of things that this was not the only village that was on this site over, the 20,000 years that people have lived in the Ohio area. So some of these other artifacts are pre-European contact artifacts. And there's a question of that too. The stuff we have on display at Great Council is all on loan from the Ohio History Connection. So we've got some stuff there to give a little bit of context, but yeah. And we're not sure. We'd like to look at what they found and their documents. We're kind of working on figuring that out right now. It is also a little messy with the way the federal government's been changing things recently to get to federally funded things like that. So, yeah, any other questions?
Well, Ryan, thank you so much
Yeah,
for
thank
taking
you.
time. all of you who have not been there, please take the time to make the trip. It is well worthwhile. And then you can stop, have lunch in Xenia, or go up and see the Buffalo Soldiers House and.
Or Yellow Springs.
Yeah, real,
Yes.
Young's.
So I didn't want to.
Really appreciate. Yeah, I mean, the whole center, it's just so
Oh, yeah.
well, I mean, it's just kind of artfully integrated. Like, you took time to show it.
Yeah.
Very, very, kudos to you.
Yeah.
So thanks very much.
Yeah.
A lot of passionate people.
Oh.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. Yeah, you were probably there on the day where the Shawnee people had been on that property since 17.
Yeah, we saw.
They had
It appeared to be.
100, yeah.
Yeah.
Citizens there.
That was really fun. It's really, it's got history. And I
Yeah.
appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I just. Yeah.
Sorry, it is.
And I was. Yeah.
So good to see you.
How are you doing?
Very good, very good. I finally retired about a year and a half
That's
ago.
my wife, Donna.
Oh, man,
There's.
Yeah.
When it was the plans.
That's my daughter and bride over there, yes. Not surprised.
He does have.
But, yeah,